All right, folks, welcome to the History Podcast. I'm your host, Pierre Bussière, and today we will be talking about Hitler's famous failed attempt at taking over, well, the entire Reich by invading a brewery, essentially. Quick note before we get started, we are drinking Dominion Brewery tonight. We're drinking Dominion City. They've been kind enough to share their beers with us. What we have here is a town and country blonde ale and what's it you have there?
We got the Sunsplit IPA.
All right.
Which I can vouch for already.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Well, I haven't even tried mine yet. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's it, Pills. Very, very, very smooth at the end. Like there's sort of a creamy side to it, which I like.
Right.
So, yeah, very good start. All right, let's do this. Ryan, I want more people to know you because I'm very interested in your work. You have studied the Gestapo, the famous, political police that was founded, created, and led by Adolf Hitler himself. Not only that, you got your PhD from the Florida University.
Florida State, yeah.
Florida State University, or did the state give you your PhD, or was it the university? Was the state involved?
No. No state policing at this point.
Okay, good. That's good to know. And also, you've written this nice little book here, The Enemies of the People, Hitler's Critics and the Gestapo. We'll get back to this eventually during the podcast. Why Hitler's critics and the Gestapo? But don't answer yet. We'll keep that for later.
Hanging in suspense.
Yes, as we want. Like we can't say everything right now. We got to keep some mystery.
Right.
So Ryan, I'm gonna dive right into it as you take another hoppy bite of that beer.
They're nice. It's nice and sweet. It doesn't taste like a salad for an IPA.
You know, I'm jealous. I love the blonde ale, but the IPAs are my type. Enough with IPAs. We are in Bavaria in 1923. There's no IPA there. We have a lot of Dunkel. We have a lot of Marzen. We have a lot of dark lager as well. And we have the future Darth Vader of, Germany at that period, Adolf Hitler. It's 1923. And there's this guy who walks to a brewery where there's a big political speech and tries to take over the state. Ryan, what's that about?
What is that about? Okay. By 1923, you have Hitler convinced that there's two things going to happen. Mm-hmm. There is going to be a revolution, regardless. Mm-hmm. So 3 years, violence, death, destruction, 2 revolutions, and 20,000 people, hostages, executions. Would make a really good movie.
That's a loaded program.
Right.
A lot happening at that time.
Right. And so by the time you reach 1923, you've essentially had 4 years of nearly nonstop, near revolution at any given point. You've had a communist republic declared. Mm-hmm. You've had the royalty killed for the state. You have had a counter-revolution that saw 20,000 people with artillery, flamethrowers, and airplanes retake a city. You've seen Bolshevik revolutionaries declare that republic and be crushed. And then by 1923, you're now into hyperinflation.
And that's because Germany is basically on its knees, like it's barely functioning as a state. There's the French, which after the First World War are asking that Germany pay this huge war payment for peace, and they can't do it because they're broke.
The Versailles Treaty.
Right.
And the stab in the back and the infamous war guilt clause. Mm-hmm. So Germany's economically ruined by 1923.
Yeah.
You've attempted to have... Well, like any good historian, I want to take about 3 steps back before and run into this thing.
I would expect nothing less.
Right. So, in 1922, you got a few things that happen. See, Hitler becomes convinced at that time that he's figured out the formula that he needs to be able to seize power in Germany. So in the years before that, he's going back and forth, mm-hmm. right? We have a vision from Hannah Arendt and the totalitarian historians, right? Like terror. People agreed with Hitler because of terror. He's super concerned with being a popular dictatorship. He thinks everything has to come from a mass movement.
Yeah.
So he's trying to build a social movement to essentially overthrow the democratic government that was put in place by the Allies, or at the demand of the Allies at the end of the First World War, and replace that, with a national dictatorship of some sort. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't know what it's going to look like yet.
He's still trying to figure out what are the right ingredients and his dictatorship brew.
Yes. Really, it's a question of order of operations. Does he put the yeast in first, or does he put the sugar in?
There
right?
you go.
So,
I was hoping you would fall in.
Come on,
Nice.
I'll play along. So, because on the one hand, he's like, I need to have a popular basis.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he's saying, I need to have some major action, the great deed, the deed he calls it, that will be what catalyzes the belief of the people that I am the one to take things forward.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't know which one needs to come first. And so he spends about 2 years developing this idea, developing the ideology around Nazism, developing the order of things that he needs to do to come to political power. But he's kind of left wondering, well, which do I need first? 1923 is what brings that into sharp focus for him.
Does history provide him with an opportunity? Is there some silver platter that he gets at his door, some unique thing that could only happen at that time? Or is it like, I'm ready to do this?
It's a couple things, right? So, as you mentioned, Versailles Treaty, in the policy of fulfillment, they just start like sending coal. The way the whole system works is you got to get money from Germany to pay debts to France, to pay debts to England, to pay debts to America, so that the Americans can finance Germany to make the whole debt cycle work, right?
Wow.
So this starts to fall apart in 1922, and prices start to go through the roof. It's like in midsummer, you're getting like food's disappearing off the shelves. You're starting to get like major inflation, runaway. Like it's not at the point yet where we're like burning money, which does happen by 1923 to heat the place.
Surely there are people who are starving to death.
They're
in
starting
some
to
places.
Yeah, and like you're getting communist revolutionaries start talking about trying to overthrow the place again. Let's not forget we're like 3 years away from literal all-out civil war across Germany at the end of the war. In several places, Munich being one of them. That's why there's such radical politics, right? So by the time you're reaching the fall there, you're starting to get the idea that like the system is going to collapse. This government can't sustain itself, right? Like people can't eat. There's no food. The money doesn't buy anything. You get your check and it's useless by the end of the week. By the time you reach 1923, it's starting to get to the point that it's useless by the end of the day, right?
That's incredible. I mean, incredibly awful. I mean, I'm a student of Soviet history. That's what I did my master's on, and the first example that comes to mind is what happens in Russia right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, like 1991, but some other dates where the new government can't really work prices well, and there's super skyrocketing inflation, and the middle class that has piled some really low amounts of money throughout their entire career in Soviet Russia, they lose it all. I'm thinking it must be something comparable, but potentially far worse.
Well, it is essentially the same thing, but with at the end of the First World War, you have an entire generation of men who come back, trained, brutalized, with machine guns in their basement.
Okay. Yeah, I get the picture. That's pretty dangerous.
Yeah,
you don't want these guys around.
So, and then, like, let's not forget, like you're talking about, right? The Russian Revolution, that has just happened, right? And when these Bolshevik revolutionaries who supported this breakaway republic in Munich in 1919, when they were challenged at the end, they took hostages and they killed them. So when the rhetoric starts coming out, right, like the red tide is coming that's going to wash away Germany from the Volga to the Rhine, right? When that rhetoric comes out, it's not abstract. It's not hyperbole.
It's very real.
It's very real.
Because you're next, like literally.
Yeah.
It happened in that country's next. After that, it's you.
And it happened here, and they killed us here.
Yeah.
And middle-class savings have been wiped out in the process. Yeah. And that means that the communist movement is resurgent again by 1923 and late 1922. So it's a very real sense of danger that Hitler is speaking to when he speaks to the middle class and a conflicted working class on whether or not it's going to be the Marxist political movements that's going to save them or it's going to be a nationalist political movement that's going to save them.
Right. It seems to me that at that time, we're talking 1920, 1921, Hitler's already like thinking about his many future or present enemies. Like he already has like several causes to fight against, like several potential crusades. He's got anti-communism. He's got anti-Russianism. Like he has a whole program about wiping out 30 millions of people in Eastern Europe and particularly in Russia. Like he's not a fan of Russia. Maybe about after the Jews, his hatred for Russia is fairly high in his top list of enemies. And what I'm saying is, so he has a lot of potential targets.
Yes.
And which one does he pick first? Like, what's his priority in 1922? Sort of going back to what you were telling me earlier, like he's thinking about the sequencing. He's talking about what people need to hear, what he needs to tell them.
So it's 1922 that the crisis is beginning to take shape, and he's believing. Everybody is thinking this government can't survive. There's no way that this system of government can persist under these conditions. Then a whole bunch of stuff starts to happen. So it gets really dicey really quickly. So in July, they kill the guy who came up with the policy. There's an assassination, a political assassination, and the guy who came up with the policy of fulfillment that has created this cycle of debt that is now falling apart, right?
The repayment scheme.
Yes. And so when he's killed, though, the government comes in and declares a state of emergency and passes a whole bunch of new emergency laws about like you can't hold speeches, you can't do this, that, the other thing. So this is how the Nazi movement has grown itself through this whole period coming up to this point already, before the crisis is there. So as this starts to shift, that's when Hitler goes, no, this is the time to act. The Marxist parties are going to make a move, right? Like the revolutionary Marxists are, when this government falls, they are going to come forward. And when they come forward, we need to be ready to react against them. So this is part of a broader strategy. Your violence can't be seen to be repressive. Your violence has to be seen as like defensive, right? So that justifies it. It's the same reason that like it's not entirely disingenuous. Like the rhetoric of like this threat coming, like the executions, the fear, right? But then what he then argues is that essentially we have to wait for the Marxists to start their revolution. When they do that, then we can strike. And he builds this out of like his experiences at the street fighting level into a grand political strategy about how to use street fighting as a form of political communication. So this keeps growing at this time. And out of this, you also get the March on Rome. So Mussolini is down in Italy.
Right.
So like in July, you get this guy gets assassinated. The new law gets passed, right? Then in response to that law, they hold a protest in, again, late August, right? At this protest, they go out and they essentially create a provocation where they get the local communists to attack them. They go out onto a big plaza and they march around with a bunch of flags and they make sure that they parade through communist, neighborhoods, things like that.
Are they trying to provoke the communists?
Because then it's defensive violence.
And then they can start their own revolution.
Right? Yeah. So it starts at this street fighting level, right? This concept that if you provoke the violence and then you crush it, not only do you communicate to the people who are watching and afraid and want protection, that you're stronger, that you can put through your political program, right? You also justify the violence that you're carrying out as defensive. So you're not the one who's creating the problem. You're the one who's solving the problem and providing protection against this outside threat that's coming to get you.
You could see how compelling that would seem to the average guy or girl who has lost a lot, who's seen his country going from a fairly prosperous state or series of state to, essentially a failed state. You could see how that would be dangerously close to truth, close enough to say, hey, that makes sense.
Well, and then add a little conspiracy.
Enough.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
You have the kernel of truth, and then you throw the conspiratorial narrative on top of it, and you have the enemy that is at the root of everything, right? So
yeah. So the foundations of the putsch are starting to be laid out now. We have this parade, this provocation.
Yep.
We have Mussolini's march to Rome, which is a putsch and is effective.
Yeah.
And now, not only does Hitler have an inspiration, he has a precedent.
Yes.
It worked before.
It worked at the local level. It worked in Italy. And then the French occupy the Ruhr. And, this is 70% of Germany's energy production. This is like it's not their breadbasket, but it is the entirety of their industrial production base. more or less.
So most of the industry at that time, most of the, let's say, added value comes from the ruhr.
Yes. So,
Right.
and that's the area that when the French move in to try and force the payments on this debt system,
Yeah.
that's the area that they take over.
Mhm.
Well, in this situation, the government says you can't do that. And the government, in this case being, I believe, a socialist government at the time, potentially national liberal. I'd have to check
Remind
that.
me the year again.
1923, beginning of 1923.
I can't remember either. I'm thinking about Front National. I know they were in power for 3 years, but I can't remember which years. Let's park that aside.
Regardless, not the important point here. The important point is what they say is do not produce anything for the French. We will print money and pay you to not work. It's called a campaign of passive resistance.
Wow.
So the French have to spend all these resources to come over here to occupy the Ruhr. They're trying to extract the coal production, steel production, finished good production. We're just not going to make anything anymore. We're not going to dig any more coal up for you. We're not going to make any more steel for you. But then people are like, well, how am I going to eat? Don't worry. We will print money and give it to your unions.
Doesn't that contribute to super high inflation?
That is what drives the hyperinflation. Yeah. So it's already on that route. It's already an issue in midsummer 1922.
How do you get out of a mess like that?
Well, you don't. In this case, right? There's an emergency stabilization afterward. It's either the Dawes plan or it's one of the two plans. But there's a gold mark stabilization that happens after the fact. That's down the road once the crisis is passed.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet.
Yeah.
But right now, we're in the midst of no, this is a good idea. This is a way to continue political negotiations with the French. Well, from the nationalist camp, they're looking at this going well, we're already worried that the Marxist parties are going to launch a revolution, right? And now you're just funneling money directly into their union structure, right? And at the same time, you're destroying the national economy. This is national suicide, right? This is the narrative, and this is the political view that the Nazis have when they're looking at this situation.
Right.
So that's when, okay, the revolution is coming, one way or the other, right? The Marxists are going to take this, in this case, the Communist Party, right? Is the radical wing of the left-wing parties there, socialists being in power, generally supporting this policy of passive resistance, right? So when the communists take all this money that they're getting into their unions, they're going to launch a revolution. When that happens, we have to be ready. The question is not whether there's going to be a dictatorship. The question is whether it's going to be a fascist dictatorship or a communist dictatorship.
Right.
So and again, because of what's happening in the Ruhr, that's where the militarization starts to happen. That's where Hitler no longer has a question. Does the mass movement come first? Does the deed come first? The deed comes first. That will be, and when we stand up, when we show, as we have been extremely successfully at the local level across Bavaria, having these provocations, exercising defensive violence, portraying that through our own propaganda machine and through our own sort of community engagement as protecting you, right? Then that will be what launches us into a national movement. And that will be what secures us power. That's what will bring us to the dictatorship.
Right.
So the question is, who's going to be the dictator? Right? And that's the negotiation that's starting to happen over the summer. Is it now? Is it going to happen now? Is it going to happen in a week from now? Is it going to happen a month from now? So the stormtroopers, the guys who are at the forefront, the pointy end.
The stormtroopers, these are the famous SS?
Not the SS, the brown shirts.
Okay.
The SA. So this is Ernst Röhm's sort of beer hall brawler bully crew, right?
Yeah.
So they're the ones who keep you safe. This is the beer hall sides of things, right? So when you go to these mass meetings, right, you go to the Löwenbräu-Keller or the Bürgerbräu-Keller, and one of these places where Hitler gets up, gives a big speech. There will be 2,000, 3,000 people there, right? So in the early days, before this is contested territory, right? Because these are the stages where you can kind of present your appeal to the people. And in the long tradition of there being no such thing as a free lunch, right? You can come for the free food, much like you would at a think tank in Washington or a soup kitchen, right? And then they hit you with the political rhetoric and the narrative.
So I think that in this case, the right expression would be there's no such thing as a free beer.
Yeah, true.
I mean, it is a beer hall. I didn't know that they served food though. Somehow I just imagine if it's called a beer hall, it's just beer. But that's silly of me. I went to Munich. I went to the Hofbrau. I know that they have gigantic pretzels, and I know I ate one or tried.
Right. Well, like these beer halls are like areas of community outrage, right? They're one of the places
Yeah.
that a lot of like how you portray the movement to the public, and you kind of like shape the public narrative and perception of the movement. It happens in these locations, right? Because like a tradition that continues after the Nazis seized power. It's called the Untitled Sonntag. It's Potluck Sundays, right? So everybody brings something in, and they create a big potluck stew.
In a beer hall?
And they ladle it out, or they'll do it in a neighborhood when like they'll put on free food. So the beer isn't free, right? The food is free.
Interesting.
But then you can come and you can get plastered, or the local party guys will buy you drinks while you listen to the speaker and are politically radicalized.
Yeah.
Right? So all of this is sort of, especially, and I mean, talk about it. We're in a period where like food's not on the streets. You know, the hyperinflation's cleared the shelves.
And I'm thinking even beer must not be cheap just because money doesn't have the same value as before. So I'm thinking that beer normally is, fairly affordable at that time and time. But then again, if your money is not worth anything, it must be kind of, I'm trying to figure out where I'm going with this because I hear myself, and this is too contradictory. Is beer accessible or is it expensive?
I'm ashamed to say that I did not research that basic question in preparation for a beer podcast.
It's one of the mysteries we'll have to eventually get back to. But the stage is set now.
Yes.
You got this. I'm gonna try to pronounce the name right. Bürger Braukeller beer hall, and Hitler's going there several times.
Yes.
He goes there and he's supported by the brown shirts.
Yes.
And he starts spreading his message.
Right.
A message of hatred, a vision for the future, a bunch of silly things if you were to read Mein Kampf. But people, they don't look at that as we people who live 70 years after the facts. There are a lot of people who think, this guy's got it.
Well,
he's got it figured out.
The message, the question is like, who counts as a German? Who counts as part of the community? And who's responsible for the current plight?
Yeah.
Right? And this, it's hard to put yourself in those shoes, but like having tried to get into that headspace for like the last 10 years, right? Like the message is basically communism, Marxism, right? These are alien cultural influences. Exploitive. There's a landmark speech that's delivered at I think the the Löwenbräu.
Okay. And that's a beer hall close by? Same city?
So you know Löwenbräu beer, right?
I'm ashamed to say I don't.
Okay, so go. It is. It's one of
It's my next task.
Yeah, try it. It's a Hefeweiss, right? So
All right.
like anyway, classic Bavarian beer. And there's a massive brewery there. These Kellers are established on tops of old breweries, right? So or on tops of active breweries.
Yeah.
You build these places. And if it's a lager or if it's something that you're aging underground, you end up with these places where you're keeping the beer. Well, sometime over the course of like the 18th, 19th century, increasingly what becomes popular is you will build a garden to just like point of sale, have people come, like the microbrewery concept of these days.
Yeah.
The ones that are successful grow larger and larger and larger. Some of them become these grand buildings in downtown Munich. The Löwenbräu is one of them. There's this landmark speech that's delivered there called the Why We Are Anti-Semites, okay? And that is where Hitler lays out his concept of a people's community. So this is the idea of like who belongs, who doesn't. So the core concept that he presents and the ideology that lets you as a German, a racial comrade who fits within that vision of community, see yourself as part of it and not see yourself as a potential victim and distance yourself from the victims. Is that essentially Germanness is all about collective effort, looking out for the common good. It's born of this like Nordic race that because of the harsh environment was forced to come together and support each other, right? Jewish culture, and by extension Marxism, because there is a whole narrative
Because
there.
somehow they're all connected.
Do you want to know about the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy? I can break it down for you because capitalism and Marxism are two sides of one coin, my friend, and they're coming for Germany.
So you're I feel like this is like if someone were to have Hitler's ideas right now, this is what he would sound like.
He would indeed. But it's one of these situations where like Karl Marx comes from the background of an ethnically Jewish family.
Yeah.
Right? So they're not a practicing family, they're Germanized family.
That's right.
It's part of, like, his father is all about Germanization and attempting, he's an integrationist, right? He raises Marx that way so that he can enter that. But this becomes a sort of like original sin in the Nazi vision of, like, once you identify communism as the external threat, and then you identify that as the product of a Jewish internal diaspora, which has a long, long history of, like, European anti-Semitism behind.
Right.
Do they have civil rights? Do they not? Do they belong here?
The anti-Semitism is already there. And one thing that doesn't help is that up until the 19th century, a lot of intellectuals or Jews, a lot of intellectuals are Jewish. And, well, fascism is fiercely anti-intellectual. Let's start right there.
Well, they have their own intellectuals. I think this is. I take issue with that point. Okay. If you look at the core leadership of the SS, and this is what's disturbing, and in many ways has parallels to our own present radicals on the right, they are university educated, and they're radicalized during this period. All of the future leadership of the SS, 60% of them have PhDs in law.
Oh, okay.
And they've gone to, like, the equivalent of, like, the German Ivy Leagues. Right?
I would have never thought.
But their parents' savings get wiped out in the hyperinflation.
Right. So they're all angry.
Yeah. And they're all coming of age at this time. And they're coming of age. If you look at Heydrich, right? Head of the future Reich Security Main Office, right? He grows up, his family, he's like, anyway, his father's a famous opera writer, right? So he's as bourgeois as you can get, right? And he grows up in Halle, and it's like 3 or 4 blocks away from where his home is. They bring in artillery to shell the local theater because there's a shootout, and he ends up working as, like, a runner for the freebooter militias that work on behalf of the government.
That is so surreal.
Yeah.
But then again, I'm remembering about Joseph Goebbels, who's played by this actor. I keep remembering his face at the end of the movie. He appears in Downfall.
Yeah, I forget
the history of the fall of Hitler.
Yep.
And I remember, I don't know if I read it in a review of the movie or if I saw it in the movie. Joseph Goebbels, the architect of Hitler's propaganda, has a PhD in literature.
Yeah, of philosophy.
Of philosophy?
Yeah.
Wow.
I believe. Oh, that's going to be bad if I'm wrong. No.
I'm pretty sure it's literature. How about we bet like a couple of pints on that?
Yeah.
The stakes are quite high, my friends.
Yeah.
Talking about philosophy here, or I mean literature.
One or the other.
Yeah. But so I think we got ourselves in a bit of a rabbit hole here, talking about the essay and the brown shirts.
But the point is that these philosophical debates that happen about, like the whole larger philosophical debate about idealism versus materialism that's run all through continental philosophy, that gets politicized under Nazism. And the guys who are on the idealist side, right? That is the intellectual wing of the Nazi Party. And they are incredibly well educated at the highest levels. Like Hans Frank, who becomes minister without portfolio and blah, 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 takes over Poland, runs it like his own private fiefdom, lives like a local lord, is responsible for, like, de-Jewification, runs the Holocaust in Poland, Polish Rum state, right? Like, he is attending international law lectures with the guy, the Jewish Soviet lawyer who ends up developing the Nuremberg principles through the 1920s. Like, these guys know each other,
dude.
And the SS
is so surreal.
Yeah, the SS intellectuals are the sons of the bourgeois who have their life savings ruined and then feel the threat of the communist revolution coming and breathing down their necks in the 1920s. So then when Hitler comes along and starts to say, I want to build a classless, like, who loves apolitical politics more than the middle class, right?
Right.
And, like, who's more nationally minded than the middle class? Like, these are general political trends over time. But then when you put them in this pressure cooker, right? This is what pops out the other side.
I'm still thinking about the Nuremberg
Yeah, no, it's seriously, it throws you for a loop, man.
You threw me off my chair there. I mean, these are the sort of paradoxes and nuances that we don't get from thinking about Hitler as just pure evil.
Yeah.
Because there's an entire machinery behind that. There's an entire context that, in the right circumstances, fabricates the sort of evil that we can't understand or know unless we go really deep in history and archives, or unless we live it ourselves, which I don't hope we ever will.
I am concerned, but that's a talk for a different day.
That's right, because once we go there, I mean, I don't think we'll talk about...
We're not going to come back to the pure hop.
And I think that we're already, venturing far away already. Okay. But so, again, we set the stage. We know that Hitler is a regular at the Bürger Brau Keller beer hall.
Yes.
And he's figured out his speech ingredients.
Yes.
He's got a crowd that is riled up. He's acquired experience as street brawler / intellectual. Is it fair to say that?
Political visionary.
So he's not a PhD. He hasn't, gone to great lengths studying history. His understanding.
That's not true.
Okay.
He's extraordinary. He was a dilettante. And the standard, like if you read the standard biographies, he's frequently dismissed as a dilettante. Okay. But he was a voracious reader. And so he's the definition of a generalist. Okay. Right? Like and one of the first things he does when he goes to prison, he gets a historiography paper commissioned from the Institute of Contemporary History to tell him about the last 40-some European revolutions and how they turned out.
So
this is the kind of guy that he is. He looks to history for analogs and examples, and then he applies them to the current situation. And he goes like, well, what applies? What principles are here? What's the step forward? And he's a sequential strategic thinker. Okay. It's not like he is, and that's another thing, frequently dismissed as an opportunist. Yes, it's contingent upon the opportunity being there that he moves, but it's during this period that he develops a strategy of like, step 1, steal underpants, step 2, ? Step 3, profit, right? And it's that movement forward that he manages to kind of execute.
I remember at the very beginning of the podcast, you were telling me he has been thinking about his program for years.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a program. He's got a method. He's got an approach. Obviously, we don't agree with what he's saying, but that doesn't mean that he's an idiot or that he's a moron.
That's why he's dangerous.
He's a monster, but he's got an approach, and he's not the only one that has that approach. And it's interesting to know how that approach gets to be developed, because it's frightening to say, but it's incredibly effective. Because he might have failed the coup, and we'll get back to that. But he eventually got himself a dictatorship. So let's go back to the putsch now. I think at that time Bavaria is fairly recent in Germany. Bavaria was a different state up until early in the 20th century. And I do remember that Berlin was already the capital for Germany at the time. Why go to Bavaria? Is it because he's there, or is it because Bavaria is very important politically?
So he moves to Munich from Vienna when he comes to Germany, and then he goes and he joins the army, serves in the First World War as a runner, comes back with a unit that returns to Bavaria. So then once he's there, he's kind of looking around, what am I going to do? And he joins what's supposed to be a de-radicalization unit that goes in.
Oh, man.
Oh, the irony is delicious.
The army sent him there, right? He was kind of their spy.
Yeah. Well, no, he was a speaker. He was a de-radicalization speaker that after the retaking was supposed to go through and talk to people, talk to workers, talk to army units, and like step them down. That's how he ends up at his first Nazi party meeting. And that's how he ends up taking over. So.
The de-radicalizing guy gets to be the radicalizing guy.
Yeah, he ends up being the one who leads the movement. He shows up to one of these meetings and he gives a speech to like the 40 members that are there. And then he says it's the best speech that he ever gave. And they're like, okay. And that's the beginning of the Nazi party. Or prior to that, it is the German Workers' Party. And he sticks around before he's voted leader. But like that's when he becomes the ideological force driving behind it. That's his first core group of people.
So the Nazi party starts as a workers' party.
Yes, the German Workers' Party.
And they elect him in 1922? Somewhere around that.
1921, I think.
21?
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, he goes to the same brewery we've been talking about, whose
the
name
Burger
keeps... You say it quite fast. I'm like, okay, there are two dots on that U, and my brain tries to process it. So why a putsch at that place? Is there because there's a bunch of important people to impress? Is it because the leadership from Berlin is traveling? What's there to do except,
So the timing, why then?
Mhm.
It's why then, and then from why then, why there. Okay, so at that point in summer, he can't keep a lid on the SA anymore. He's under pressure to act. He's been holding them on a leash for about 6 months, and it's reached the point where if he doesn't do something, they're just going to leave him, right? And as they say, a politician without a following is just a man taking a walk, right? So it's better to be in charge than not. So at that point, because the hyperinflation is in full swing at this point, you have people who are taking wheelbarrows of money to get food.
Right.
Okay. So at this point, it's like, okay, we're just waiting for an excuse to go. There is a state of emergency declared in Bavaria, and Gerhard Ritter von Kahr is placed in charge, and he has a plan to have his own dictatorship. Now, Hitler is part of a group of sort of a right-wing network that is connected to this guy who's declared sort of the state secretary for Bavaria to manage this state of emergency, right? So he knows that this is going on. And the group that he's moving with goes and talks to Kahr and says, hey, will you support us? We know that this is going to happen. At this point, we need to initiate, because otherwise we're going to lose all our radicals and they're going to go and join the communists. So we got to go now or never, right? And Kahr says, no, right? Hitler goes like, great, you want to have a dictatorship? I'm behind it. I'm going to hold 15 meetings. And Kahr doesn't want the interference. He wants his candidate for dictator to go through. So he blocks those meetings and bans Hitler from holding these meetings at this time, right? So then Kahr, with his proposed candidate for dictator, goes to hold a big meeting. 3,000 people show up at the Bürgerbräu Keller on the night that the putsch happens.
The silver platter.
Yes. So you have all of the potential leadership. You have the current state secretary of Bavaria, who's the guy with all the powers to give you the executive powers to do what you need to do in Bavaria, who has the connections with the military and the support there. And Hitler's already made common cause. He's just appearing out of nowhere here. Ludendorff, part of the dynamic duo of the German general staff in World War I, like hero of the Eastern Front, fought with Hindenburg, villain in Wonder Woman. All the important boxes.
Oh, right. He's Ares.
Yeah.
He's the bad guy.
He is the bad guy.
Sorry for those who watched the movie. I just realized I spoiled it.
Oh, sorry. Anyway, and Hitler has him as a potential figurehead, but von Kahr has all the executive powers. So von Kahr goes and holds his thing. Hitler gets the boys together, right? Hops on the trucks with the SA. He goes down and he gets up in front and basically fires a shot. He takes out a pistol, fires a shot in the ceiling, goes, "This is a revolution." He takes von Kahr.
So that's how we make those. You need a pistol, and
Yeah.
you shoot the ceiling, and then you just declare yourself owner of all souls.
Yes. But
I
there's
didn't know that.
a little political finagling you got to do here,
Yeah.
right? Okay? So first you got to take all of your potential revolutionary rivals into the back room.
Got it.
You sit them down with your buddies and you go, try and bring them around to their point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Hitler then goes out, holds an oration, hijacks the crowd, right? And he speaks, I think it's for 2.5 hours, right? Well, the core around him are trying to convince von Kahr in the back room, look, support us. We have the people. We have the following. We have the stormtroopers.
Mm-hmm.
We have the militias. We have the party network. You need us. Let us go, right? Support us. And then Hitler whips the crowd up. He gets all the support and thunderous applause, off and on, several times. It's interrupted by sort of bouts of cheering for 2 or 3 minutes, about 10 times over the course of this oration. A fact which obviously cannot fail to make an impression on the little circle of people that you have trapped in the back room that you're working at the same time.
Well, I'm thinking that, first of all, they're afraid for their physical security because, the guys there have guns. And then I'm thinking, maybe they're also worried about the crowd's reaction when they get out of the place. Because if they say no in public and there's a mob of angry folks who've had plenty of beer, there's a chance that they'll just get beat up.
Yeah, right. And so you're the one who says you want to have a revolution. This guy says he wants to have a revolution. Why are you standing in the way of the revolution?
Yeah.
Right?
Literally.
Yeah. So Hitler finally, and in a masterful sort of piece of oration, says like, I don't want to be the dictator. I'm not trying to be selfish.
Of course,
here,
he doesn't
right?
want to
Like,
be dictator.
we just want it to happen, man. Right? Like, so can I go back there and tell Von
Mhm.
Kahr that we have your support for the revolution now?
Yeah.
Crowd goes wild, right? So then he goes into the back room and he goes like, hey, so you gonna do it now? And they're like, yeah, we're gonna do it now, right? So then there's an emergency over the course of the night, right? Like all of the individual parts of the state military, the state police, like all of the different sort of organs of state authority, right, are kind of like checking their loyalties. And so Hitler gets up and he leaves in sort of like to go look after an emergency somewhere else, right?
Well, so you're telling me Hitler, who's worked on this program for 2 years, gets there, riles the crowd up, speaks for 2 hours and a half,
Yep.
and then he has an emergency.
Then he has because he has to go convince I don't know, maybe he has to go convince somebody I don't know what the emergency is that he goes to address.
But I think I understand like the bigger point, which is it's not just happening in that brewery. It's not just happening in the beer
It's
hall.
happening everywhere, and he has
That's
to go
it.
and ply these people,
Yeah.
and like it's all happening at once, and nobody knows where the loyalties are. So
Right.
if he shows up, it matters, right?
Because he's telling his essay at the time to go secure strategic locations.
And sometimes they're getting in firefights with the police. Sometimes
Yeah.
they're being shot at. Sometimes they're being welcomed. Like it's all over the map, right? So his
Yeah.
presence matters. It matters where he is over the course of this crisis.
Yeah.
But he leaves Von Kahr with Ludendorff alone
In the same room.
in the same room.
Is
And
there
he's
a guy?
not there anymore to kind of like, and nobody, like, what are you going to tell the war hero of World War I for Germany that he can't tell these people that they can go when they ask?
Yeah.
And they ask. And Ludendorff says yes. And so Von Kahr goes and then immediately goes and kicks the whole emergency response structure into overdrive, being like, this guy's trying to take over Bavaria and I want to be dictator. I don't want him to be dictator. So we got to clamp down on this. And he does it with all the authority of the state secretary, with all the executive powers that he has. Right? So all of a sudden, the state secretary, who has been being held, is back in the open, and, in contact, exercising authority. Like, I don't know if you've seen Valkyrie, right? Like, how important this idea of like, if the dictator, the person with the executive authorities, can't be contacted, that's when you have room to operate. But all of a sudden, Von Kahr's back on the scene,
Yeah.
right? And he's directing the state response again.
And he's got a real incentive to get rid of Hitler
Yes.
and to make sure that the essay don't do anything stupid, because now he knows their plan.
Yes. And well, so anyway, now it becomes like, this is now a struggle over who's going to be the dictator, right? So anyway, over the course of the night, Ludendorff rejoins and they're kind of like, what do we do? So they go and they take the city council of Munich, I believe. Anyway, they take some city officials hostage. Right?
What, Ludendorff?
No, Ludendorff and Hitler and like the Nazi crew, right?
What?
Well, Ludendorff's still on side. He's just like, oh, gentleman's agreement. You can go, sir. Right? Like,
What a noble thing to say.
right?
I mean, it seems like someone from the upper bourgeois society would say, well, I trust your word. You're a nobleman. After all,
Exactly.
like, you're a man of principles. I
Yes.
don't know. I'm just making that voice up. I don't know how
100%.
Ludendorff sounded, and I don't even have my German accent, but still, yes.
So, middle of the night, they still have these hostages, but like they don't have the actual executive authority anymore. That bird's out of hand, right? So then they're like, well, what do? We don't know. And Ludendorff, like, who is half senile at this point, but anyways, like,
How old
"Wir
is he? Like, is he like
marschieren."
80, 90?
I don't know. He's kind of. Anyway, so on the whole point,
He's old.
Yeah, he's old, and on the whole point of like the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy and that whole kind of worldview of conspiracy that gets stitched together, he has key components of it that's why he's an important figurehead to have, right?
Okay.
And he's responsible for advancing the idea of the stab in the back. That the German army was never defeated in the field; it was betrayed at home by Marxists. So that's another reason why the current Marxist parties bear the sin of like Germany's downfall and the humiliation of Versailles.
And that's reinforced by the very same rhetoric that says that anyways, the Marxists are trying to bring down the state.
Yes.
So there has been a stab in the back.
Yes.
And we know there's going to be another stab in the back in the form of an anti-capitalist revolution from the same guys who toppled the monarchy in Russia, who, as we know, are our cousins.
And never mind the fact that we have a Marxist party in government right now, the SPD. Just forget that. But anyway,
Oops, whoopsie.
so Ludendorff says, "We march, wir marschieren," as like, do something.
So just to make sure, Ludendorff, he is on board with this.
Yes.
He wants the revolution.
Yeah, no, he just totally misstepped and released the person that they needed to keep under their control.
Well, that's just perfect.
Right. So they get, once again, they get the boys. They get into a column.
The boys. That sounds awful. So they just got the boys and, got it going.
That is the level of politics that we're dealing at here, right?
Wow.
Like, I mean, there's much more organization and paramilitarism that gets worked into it, but like, yeah.
I'm just amazed at how much chaos and how much improvisation and how much messiness there was in the whole thing.
Oh yeah. By the point that it's actually happening, it's touch and go the whole way.
I mean, I wonder if Hitler knows what's going on. I wonder if what's the name of this guy who's the boss of the brown shirts, the SA?
Ernst Röhm.
Does he know what's going on?
So he stays behind. I forget what happens when, like his role in the power struggle or like mini power struggle when they release von Kahr.
Yeah.
He's there, but like when he leaves with the SA from the Bürgerbräu Keller later that night, I think they have an understanding, or von Kahr manages to convince Ludendorff that he has to go do something to like issue an order to make sure that the state authorities support the putsch, right? I don't know on that last point. I forget what the
well, that's the
reasoning
thing.
is. Yeah.
There's so much things happening at that time, and it's taking so many different directions at the same time. I mean, the whole brewery. The whole beer hall thing. That's no longer center. People are. It's pretty late in the night already. Now there's this state of emergency.
Yep.
And Hitler is going to different meetings. What happens in the morning? Like, what's the hangover of the putsch?
Well, it's not over yet. It's like 3, 4 in the morning. This is the point. Like Hitler's back at headquarters. They have their hostages, and they're like, "Well, what do we do?" Right?
They have hostages.
They have hostages now. They don't have the right hostages, but they have hostages.
Right.
And they're like, "Well, what do we do now?" And everybody's kind of at a loss. And that's when Ludendorff pipes up and goes, "Wir marschieren," like we march.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just kind of are like, so they get the boys, and then. They strike out down the street. They don't know where they're going, and then they just kind of get redirected. Ludendorff's like, I'm an old military guy. They'll know me. Let's go to the Ministry of Defense. They'll support us. I'm a war hero, right? Which he is.
Yeah,
it's not a bad move. If you don't know, like, out of everything you could do in this total disaster, like this is your last straw to grasp.
Basically, as if you had a retired 5-star general who was living on his ranch, I don't know, in Texas, who decided to get the boys and march on Washington and say, the White House guys, they'll know me. I fought a couple wars.
Yeah.
I'm their guy.
Yeah.
They'll trust me.
Exactly. I still got friends. I've got friends.
Yeah.
Right? So, and this is where the famous blood flag incident happens. And this is where the Nazi order comes from, right? Order of medal order, not directive order. Anyway. So they're marching toward the ministry, right? The police have heard that this is happening. They've assembled themselves, and there's this back and forth where they're like, "Don't come, we'll shoot." And they're like, "We're coming, support us." "Don't come, we'll shoot. Support us," right? And then they open fire on the column, right? So this is the infamous blood flag, which is like one of the core symbols of Nazism, and one of the highest orders is called the Order of the Blood Flag. So this means that you were part of the putsch. And the blood flag, there becomes this mythology built up around it, that the guy who's bearing the standard, right, takes the bullet and like bleeds all over the flag, right? So that then, the troops step aside, and Ludendorff is just like, keeps walking along, right? The police open ranks, he walks through, they close, they arrest him. And they're just like, "Hello, sir."
You're now arrested, sir.
Yeah, and then the rest of the Nazis just sort of like flee because a bunch of they've just been fired on by a bunch of rifles, right? So, and that is the end of the putsch.
The entire thing just collapses right there.
Yeah,
Ludendorff marches forward. He's welcome. "Hey man, sorry you're arrested."
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that they would say anything remotely close to "Hey man." It's more like,
"Hello, sir.
Good day, my good sir."
Yeah.
And then, how about Hitler? He does get arrested, doesn't he?
He does get arrested, and then he turns his whole court case into essentially a grandstand to
Mhm.
present the what he's done as an attempt to save the nation, right?
Yeah.
The putsch is supposed to be, again, like and he is genuinely convinced that like a dictatorship is coming. This government is going to collapse.
Yeah.
It's now or never. Like the timing and whether we initiate all of the tactics and strategy that are come around it, right? Like leaving that all aside, he does genuinely believe
Yeah.
that it's a choice of dictatorships at this point, right? And he wants it to be nationalist. Like he's not a neutral party in this, right?
I'm so worried when I hear something like that. You are convinced that you have to do the coup or the putsch or the revolution because there has to be revolution. And I'm thinking, what a terrible thing to act on, because it's necessarily a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah,
Because the first thing that happens, if people think they're true, if people think that that's true, that you need to do revolution to avoid another revolution, is that when people believe that, they now believe that there's a more worrying revolution, and that automatically justify you needed to do the revolution, whether it's true or not that someone else is planning a revolution. A wrong fact has become a real thing,
Mhm.
or a, I don't know how to best put it, but I think you get what I mean.
Yep.
It's like, I think that this is what I find most fascinating about this whole rhetoric of the necessity of a revolution, is that kind of thing, the logic behind it
Mhm.
is nearly universal. I don't think it's just a modern thing, and I don't think that as modern as it is, it only belongs to the 19th century or the 20th century. I think that, and there are plenty of different topics we can, narrow down on. But anytime you think that you think in those terms, you are a participant in the
Mhm.
very thing that you want to avoid, and you make it happen.
Mhm.
For me, that sounds disingenuous, but it's more dangerous than that on several fronts.
Well, it's also important to put, so yes,
Yeah.
right. You're the Nazis are also not the people who are going to be the ones who are trying to uphold this system. Like it is seen as again the capitalist wing of this whole Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. It's been imposed by the international financiers that are using it to subvert Germany, that have constructed this debt system that is hollowing the country out, is going to turn Germany into a slave state. So like democracy, there's a whole rhetoric and sort of political ideology that grows up on the attacks against democracy as like the rule of and like they are rhetorics that you would recognize from today about like democracy allows special interest or moneyed interest, vested interest.
That's what I find most worrying, because while it might be true, it's not unavoidable. So it's
Yes.
not intrinsically part of the system.
The second, but fortunately, we have established democratic institutions.
Yeah.
And the difference is that in Germany at that time, we're talking about a period of 4 years of revolution and furor
That's
and
right.
collapse of a political
And we should
system.
not forget that. And I think it's the right place to end this podcast. It's very easy, I would say, to judge what the regular average normal person might do in a time of economic, political, social, and military duress. And to know to which extent Germany at that time was in a just appallingly terrible situation. I think it's the least we can do to try and understand what happened there. Not to justify anything Hitler did, of course, but just to understand, like, at least the average Joe.
Well, and I mean, how they come to support people like that.
Yeah.
I think that's what's disturbing, is that people in distress will reach to whoever validates their concern.
Yeah. All right. So that was super sad. It was such a it's kind of a really sad ending for a podcast.
What, Nazis aren't an upbeat topic? I don't know.
All right, Ryan, always a pleasure talking to you. Don't forget to drink some of that hoppy beer. You barely touched it. You were too passionate about talking about history, for which I am very grateful, my friend. For those who are listening to the podcast or watching on YouTube, we're very happy to have your company. Please subscribe if you like what we do. We'll be back next week for another episode. And again, many thanks to my friend Ryan. If you're interested, you can buy his book, probably on Amazon. It's called Enemies of the People, Hitler's Critics and the Gestapo. All right, that's it for today. Thanks very much for having been with us, and cheers.